Tuesday, May 3rd, 2016. Margaret Hammond makes the call that is every parent's worst nightmare. Her daughter Natalie has been missing for 48 hours. Natalie had been at Margaret's house a few days prior, and she hasn't heard from her daughter since. "What's the specific concern that's called you to phone the police?" the operator asked. "Him," said Margaret. "31-year-old mother of three Natalie Hammond lived on Alderney Avenue in Milton Keynes, England, with her partner Paul. She had her eldest daughter Kirsty with a previous partner, and she had two more children with Paul, a 6-year-old boy and a girl who was 3. Paul and Natalie had been together since 2007. One of Natalie's sisters, Joanne, described her as very loud and outspoken, but kind and caring in equal measure. Her family all said that her children were her life, and anything she could do to help people, she would. Family and friends of Natalie not only didn't believe she'd have left without telling anyone or left without her children, but they felt that something much darker had happened. They all believed her partner Paul would be at the centre of whatever it was. Everyone that knew Natalie told the police that Paul was mentally and physically abusive, controlling, manipulative and possessive, and had been since the start of the relationship. Just a few months into the pair dating, Paul had become violent. He once drove her to a woods where he beat her and broke her nose. He embarrassed her and talked down to her in front of friends and family, once even spitting in her face in front of everyone. He made her sleep naked on the bedroom floor, and whenever she turned around or tried to get up, he would kick her. Paul had promised to marry Natalie, but called off the wedding 3 times. Natalie went as far as buying her dress, booking the venue and inviting guests, before Paul cancelled all the plans without telling her, leaving her absolutely humiliated. Amidst all the cancellations, Natalie changed her surname and took Paul's by way of a compromise. But after years of abuse, Natalie had geared up the strength to leave Paul twice, once in 2010 and then again 3 years later. Her sister Joanne said she had it all planned. She was going to move into her own place with the children and was excited about starting a new life. "I'm really going to do it this time," she told us. In 2013, with the relationship getting worse, she took her 3 children and went to live in Yorkshire close to her sister. Over the next few months, Natalie started to rebuild hers and her children's lives and start afresh. But she moved back in with Paul 4 months later, and her family were devastated. And in 2016, 3 years later, Natalie Hammond was now missing. What followed was one of the biggest searches in the history of the Thames Valley Police. One of Natalie's close friends said that Natalie had texted her in the weeks before she had disappeared. She told her that she had ended it with Paul for good, and she had met someone at work called Simon, who totally doted on her. Natalie's friend told her to be careful, but Natalie assured everyone that the relationship with Paul was finally over. They had both agreed to end it amicably, and she was finally moving on. Paul had even started looking for flats to move into, and she was looking at other places to live with the children. Sunday afternoon, April 30th. Natalie drove to her mum's house and dropped off the children before getting picked up by Simon for their very first date. Later that evening, Natalie and Paul's baby girl wasn't settling down, so Margaret rang Paul to come and pick her up. When he arrived, he noticed that Natalie's car was still parked on the street, but Natalie wasn't in the house. He asked where she was. Natalie hadn't said where she was going, so Margaret assumed that she had been picked up with friends to go for a drink. Natalie and Simon were seen out on their first date before leaving the following day, on May 1st. They seemed happy and content, and the pair sent messages to each other later that day. Natalie went back to her mother's house to collect her children and her car, and they all headed back to Alderney Avenue. Simon messaged her on WhatsApp just before 5 p.m. The message was delivered and read, but Natalie didn't respond. Later on, he sent 2 further messages, checking to see if she was okay. These messages were delivered, but never opened. Margaret began ringing Natalie too, but got no answer. Margaret decided to go to the house that she shared with Paul. Paul told her she'd gone to spend time with some friends, but her car was still in the driveway, and Margaret instantly felt that something was wrong. After this conversation with Paul, she rang 999 and reported her daughter missing.
Thames Valley Police, Suzanne speaking. How can I help?
Yes, my love. My daughter's been missing for 48 hours. We have just been up to Milton Keynes to her partner, and he says he doesn't know where she is.
Okay, right. Well, can I take your daughter's name, please?
It's Natalie Hammond.
Following this, the police went straight to Natalie and Paul's home just after midnight. One of the officers asked to have a look at Paul's phone, but he said he needed to keep it with him in case Natalie called. They then asked to do a routine search of the house, which Paul also pushed back on. Paul said that Natalie had been away the previous day, and upon her return to the house, she said she needed some time alone. She gave no indication as to where she was going, but she left the family home, and that was the last time he had seen her. 6 a.m, May 4th, the morning after she was reported missing. Following an evasive interview with Paul, the police placed him under arrest. As he was leaving the house, he turned to officers and said, "Have you found Natalie then?"
Well, if I recap first on Natalie's disappearance, she was last seen on Sunday after going to visit her mum in Hemel Hempstead. Now, she's not been seen since then, and that's why there is so much concern over her welfare. Natalie is a mum of 3. She, as I say, lives in Milton Keynes, and she's not been in contact with any member of her family since. She's not touched her bank accounts, and detectives here today say that is ringing alarm bells.
We are extremely concerned now about Natalie. She hasn't been in contact with her children. She hasn't been in contact with her family. She hasn't turned up at work. These are all the normal things that we would have expected her to have done.
Paul was interviewed, as was his and Natalie's son. Their 6-year-old son said he had heard a noise in the night that was so loud it sounded like thunder and smashing glass. He snuck downstairs and peered through a gap in the door, where he saw his mum lying down covered in a blanket, and his dad was cleaning something up. Not wanting to get into trouble for being out of bed, he hurried upstairs and went back to sleep. He then innocently made a passing comment to the child protection officers that alarmed them even more. He said the red rug in the living room had wet patches on it and his dad had taken it to work to clean it, but the rug hadn't returned. He drew a diagram for the police of the living room and pointed out where he'd seen everything.
We'll move on to the account of Bevan. Bevan said he went downstairs when he heard the noise and peeked through a gap in the door. He thought it was Mum being sick. He said it was really loud, like thunder, and it sounded like 3 glasses smashing. He describes the big red rug in the lounge as being missing. Have you removed a rug from your house recently?
No comment.
And if so, why?
No comment.
Following this, Paul's car was seized and the police made more appeals.
Found a red rug. Now this rug is missing from Natalie's house, and I believe it's very significant in relation to her disappearance. Now my appeal today is for anybody who has seen a rug or similar rug discarded anywhere, particularly within Aylesbury, into Oxford, Milton Keynes, over into the border of Bedfordshire, that's seen that, has picked it up, moved it, to come forward and speak to us.
During another interview with Paul, he made a shocking claim. He said that he had been home all day on Sunday when Natalie had returned that evening. She was acting oddly and wasn't her usual self. She then confessed to Paul that she had met up with someone from work and gone back to his house. She then said she had been raped by this man and needed space to process everything. Paul said he then went to bed at around 9 p.m, and when he got up the next morning, Natalie was gone. But police knew from looking at the messages between Simon and Natalie, this just didn't match up with what Paul had claimed. Despite Paul saying he hadn't left the house all day that Sunday, his car was picked up at around 10 p.m. that night, driving miles away from their house.
It's automatic number plate recognition. Now, you've told us that you did not leave your house Sunday night into Monday.
Correct.
Yet your car does leave the house. What was your car doing out at that time?
No comment.
Okay.
What you're saying is that I have killed my partner. I have disposed of her body. I have tidied the house, made it look pristine, managed to cook them dinner and many more things without them knowing.
That's exactly what we're saying, Paul.
Impossible.
Okay. And at exactly 8 p.m, I'll conclude this interview.
A forensic search of the house found blood on some of the furniture in the living room and in the boot of his car. Paul had said that the blood was probably from himself or Natalie, accidentally cutting themselves on something. Mobile data analysis confirmed that Natalie's phone showed no activity from the 2nd of May onwards, and her digital footprint was totally non-existent. With all the information the team had now gathered, police knew that Natalie was no longer alive, and the investigation was escalated from a missing persons case to a murder inquiry. Looking at the timeline of events, they knew that Paul had killed Natalie on Sunday evening, May 1st. They believed that she had returned that day and told Paul she was now seeing Simon. Following this, in a jealous rage, Paul had beaten her to death in the living room, which was partially heard and seen by their son, before he wrapped her body up and drove out to hide her late that night. Paul returned to the family home where the children were still sleeping. When the kids got up the next morning, Paul told them their mother had left the house in the night. He then took the children to Whipsnade Zoo for a bank holiday day out. At 9 p.m. on May 6th, he was charged with the murder of Natalie Hemming. But police still needed to find Natalie's body, and Paul was giving nothing away, refusing to tell anyone where she was. Everyone believed that this was the last bit of control he was trying to cling on to.
In woods near Milton Keynes, police search for a missing mum of 3. Natalie Hemming was last seen on Sunday the 1st of May. Her partner, Paul Hemming, who's 42, is charged with her murder. Police have widened the search to Bedfordshire and Oxfordshire, with nearly 50 detectives working on the case.
3 weeks after she had been reported missing, human remains were found 30 miles away in a wooded area called Chandler's Cross, by a man who had been out mowing a meadow. It was later confirmed that these were the remains of Natalie Hemming. A pathologist said it was impossible to say what exactly had caused her death because of the state of decomposition, but she did have a skull fracture and a fracture to her left arm. At the start of what would be a 9-day trial, Paul pleaded not guilty to murder and instead tried to make a plea of manslaughter. He said that they had grappled with one another during an argument about her new relationship, and he'd hurled a heavy ornament at her. He said he didn't aim it at her head, but it struck her there accidentally, causing her to fall onto the rug and stop breathing. He said he knew she was dead, and then, in a state of panic, he set about covering up what he'd done. But the police didn't accept his plea of manslaughter, and instead pushed on with the trial to try and obtain a conviction for murder. In November 2016, everyone got what they had been hoping for. A jury unanimously found Paul Hemming guilty for the murder, and he was handed a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. Upon his sentencing, officers in the courtroom saw Paul turn to Natalie's mother and sisters and mouth, "I loved every minute." His children have no direct contact with him, Joanne is raising Natalie's 2 girls, and Kerry is raising her son. Joanne is now an ambassador for advocacy after fatal domestic abuse. They support family and friends who have lost a loved one through domestic violence. Kirsty, Natalie's oldest daughter, later spoke out about the brutal way her stepfather had treated her and her siblings. She took part in a documentary called Behind Closed Doors, Through the Eyes of a Child, and she was one of 4 children that bravely spoke out about the domestic abuse they had witnessed or experienced, and the effect of living in such a frightening home. She is also the patron of a charity called Operation Encompass, which helps protect children from the effects of domestic violence. Kirsty has said she is a much more confident and strong person now, and wants to continue to raise awareness and carry on being her mother's voice. If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in today's episode surrounding domestic abuse and domestic violence, I've left links to further resources in the description box below.